A millionaire gave $1,000 to a beggar woman. The next day he saw her cornered by police and immediately intervened. The rain pattered against the windscreen of William Ashworth's Bentley as his chauffeur navigated through the winding roads of the Hampshire countryside. The leather-bound journal on his lap remained unopened, just as it had for the past 27 years. The same routine, day after day, brought him to the serene churchyard where his beloved Elizabeth rested. At 72, William's face bore the marks of a man who had experienced both tremendous success and profound sorrow. His silver hair, meticulously groomed, and his bespoke suit spoke of his wealth, but his eyes held a permanent shade of melancholy that no amount of money could erase. "We've arrived, sir," Thompson, his chauffeur of 2 decades, announced softly. William nodded, gathering his umbrella and the journal. The rain had intensified, creating a curtain of water that seemed to separate him from the rest of the world. He made his way through the iron gates, his polished Oxford shoes leaving prints in the wet grass. The familiar path led him to Elizabeth's final resting place, marked by a white marble headstone adorned with fresh roses, replaced daily by the groundskeeper under William's strict instructions. He stood there, umbrella in hand, lost in memories of their 30 years together. "My dearest Elizabeth," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the rain, "another day without you." The journal in his hand contained their story, every moment they had shared, every dream they had built together. From their first meeting at Cambridge University to their last conversation on that fateful spring morning, William had documented it all. Yet he had never found the strength to read it since her passing. Through the rain, he noticed something unusual. A figure huddled beneath a nearby oak tree. A young woman, perhaps in her late 20s, clutched a bundle close to her chest, attempting to shield it from the rain. Her clothes, though neat, showed signs of wear, and her expression held a mixture of desperation and determination. William watched as she adjusted her position, revealing what she held: a baby, no more than a few months old, wrapped in a thin blanket. The sight stirred something in him, a feeling he hadn't experienced in years. The young woman reminded him of Elizabeth, particularly in the way she protectively held her child. Against his usual preference for solitude, William found himself moving toward them. The young woman noticed his approach and straightened up, her posture defensive yet dignified. "You'll catch your end out here," William said, extending his umbrella to cover them. "May I offer you a ride somewhere?" The woman hesitated, studying his face. "We're fine, thank you," she replied, her accent revealing a local upbringing. "Just waiting for the rain to ease." The baby stirred, letting out a small whimper. William noticed the woman's hands trembling, either from cold or exhaustion. "Please," he insisted, "at least let me help you find somewhere dry. My car is just outside the gates." Something in his voice must have conveyed his sincerity, for the woman's resistance began to waver. "I'm Sarah," she said finally, "and this is James." "William Ashworth," he replied, noticing how she showed no recognition of his name, despite his prominence in local business circles. "Come, let's get you both out of this weather." As they walked toward the car, William cast one last glance at Elizabeth's grave. For the first time in 27 years, he was breaking his routine of spending exactly 1 hour in silent contemplation. Somehow, he felt Elizabeth would have approved. Thompson opened the car door without betraying any surprise at the unexpected passengers. Sarah settled in with James, who had fallen asleep despite the rain and movement. "Where can we take you?" William asked, noting how Sarah seemed to shrink into the leather seat, conscious of her damp clothes against the luxurious interior. "The bus station would be fine," she replied quietly, but William could sense there was more to her story. "Perhaps," he suggested, "you'd consider joining me for tea first. There's an excellent cafe in the village that serves a proper English breakfast. You both look like you could use a warm meal." Sarah's hesitation was visible, but the genuine concern in William's voice seemed to reach her. After a moment's consideration, she nodded, adjusting the blanket around James. As Thompson drove toward the village, William found himself studying Sarah's profile. There was something hauntingly familiar about her features, though he couldn't quite place it. Perhaps it was just her vulnerability that reminded him of Elizabeth in their early days, when they were young and facing their own struggles. The rain continued its steady rhythm against the windows, but inside the car, a subtle shift had occurred. For the first time in nearly 3 decades, William felt the stirring of something new, A purpose, perhaps, or at least a deviation from the carefully constructed routine that had become his life. Chapter 2. An Unexpected Turn. The Bell and Crown Cafe offered a welcome respite from the persistent rain. William guided Sarah and James to a quiet corner table, away from the curious glances of the morning regulars who rarely saw him in the company of others. The warmth of the cafe brought color back to Sarah's cheeks as she cradled James, who had awakened and was now contentedly watching the ceiling fan's lazy rotation. William ordered a full breakfast for Sarah and tea for himself, noting how she attempted to maintain her dignity despite her obvious hunger. "How long have you been in Hampshire?" William asked, keeping his tone conversational as their tea arrived. Sarah's fingers wrapped around the warm cup. "A few months. We moved here for a fresh start." She paused, seeming to weigh her next words carefully. "Things haven't quite worked out as planned." William nodded, understanding the weight of unfulfilled plans. "And the baby's father?" "It's just us," Sarah replied, her chin lifting slightly. "But we manage." As their conversation continued, William observed the careful way Sarah handled herself, her refined manner of speaking, her straight posture, hints of a proper upbringing that seemed at odds with her current circumstances. She reminded him increasingly of someone, though the connection remained frustratingly elusive. The breakfast arrived, and Sarah ate with measured restraint despite her evident hunger. James began to fuss, and she expertly prepared a bottle while maintaining their conversation. William found himself impressed by her composure and determination. "What brought you to the churchyard this morning?" he asked, pouring more tea. Sarah's hands stilled momentarily. "I was looking for someone, actually. My birth mother." She spoke the words carefully, watching for his reaction. "All I have is an old photograph and a name, Elizabeth." William's teacup clattered against its saucer. "Elizabeth?" His voice wavered slightly. "Yes," Sarah continued, reaching into her worn handbag. "Elizabeth Ashworth. I only recently learned her name, and when I discovered she was buried here..." She trailed off as she noticed William's pallor. "Mr. Ashworth? Are you all right?" William stared at the photograph Sarah had placed on the table. It showed a younger Elizabeth, her familiar smile brightening her face, standing in front of their old London house. He recognized the dress she wore, blue with white flowers, a favorite of hers from the summer of 1996. "That's my wife," he whispered, his fingers trembling as they reached for the photograph. "But she never told me." Sarah's eyes widened as understanding dawned. "Your wife? Then you're..." She couldn't complete the sentence as James chose that moment to drop his bottle, breaking the heavy silence with his startled cry. The cafe owner approached their table, concern evident on her face. "Everything all right, Mr. Ashworth?" William nodded automatically, his mind racing. He pulled out his wallet, leaving several notes on the table. "Sarah, please, would you come back to my house? I think we have much to discuss." Sarah gathered James close, her expression a mixture of shock and uncertainty. "I never meant to. I wasn't looking for money or anything. I just wanted to know where I came from." "I understand," William replied softly, though his own emotions were in turmoil. "But I believe I need to know this story as much as you do." They left the cafe in silence, the rain having finally ceased. Thompson was waiting with the car, and as they drove through the winding lanes toward William's estate, the questions multiplied in his mind. Why had Elizabeth never told him? What other secrets had she carried? And most importantly, what did this mean for his carefully ordered world? The journal in his pocket seemed to weigh heavier now, holding perhaps more answers than he had realized. After 27 years of avoiding its contents, the time had come to open those pages and face whatever truths lay within. Sarah sat beside him, her posture tense, while James dozed in her arms. William noticed her hands shaking slightly as she adjusted the baby's blanket. In her profile, he could now see traces of Elizabeth, the curve of her jaw, the slight tilt of her head. How had he not noticed it immediately? As they approached the iron gates of his estate, William realized that his life, so carefully structured around preserving Elizabeth's memory, was about to change irrevocably. The question was whether he was ready to embrace that change, or if the weight of this revelation would prove too heavy for his heart to bear. Chapter 3. Hidden Pages. The study at Ashworth Manor remained unchanged since Elizabeth's time, its oak-paneled walls lined with leather-bound books and family photographs. William sat behind his mahogany desk, the journal before him, while Sarah perched nervously on an antique armchair, James sleeping peacefully in a makeshift bed fashioned from cushions beside her. The morning light filtered through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the Persian carpet. William's hands trembled as he finally opened the journal, its pages crackling with age. Sarah watched, hardly daring to breathe as he began to read. "My dearest William," Elizabeth's first entry began, dated spring 1996. "There are truths I must confess, though my heart aches with the weight of them." William's voice faltered and he cleared his throat before continuing. The entry spoke of Elizabeth's life before their marriage, of a brief relationship during her university years, and of a decision that would shape multiple lives. "I carried our child in secret," Elizabeth had written, "knowing I couldn't provide the life she deserved. The choice to give her up for adoption haunts me daily, but I pray she found a loving family." Sarah's hands clutched the arms of her chair, her knuckles white. William paused, reaching for the crystal decanter on his desk and pouring himself a small measure of brandy. His eyes met Sarah's, and in them she saw a mixture of pain and wonder. "There's more," he said softly, turning the page. "She wrote about watching you from afar." The journal revealed Elizabeth's careful monitoring of Sarah's life through a private investigator. She had known of Sarah's adoption by the Thompsons, a middle-class family from Surrey. She had collected newspaper clippings of Sarah's academic achievements and had even attended her university graduation, standing at the back of the hall, unnoticed. "She was there?" Sarah whispered, tears welling in her eyes. "All that time?" William nodded, his own emotions threatening to overwhelm him. "She never stopped thinking about you. But why didn't she tell me?" He turned another page, finding an entry from their 10th wedding anniversary. "William's love for children is boundless," Elizabeth had written. "His work with children's charities, his kindness to our nephews and nieces, it makes my secret even more painful to bear. But how can I tell him now, after so many years? Would he ever forgive my silence?" The grandfather clock in the corner chimed 11, making them both start. James stirred but didn't wake, his peaceful breathing a counterpoint to the heavy silence in the room. "Mr. Ashworth," Sarah began, then corrected herself. "William, I should go. This is too much to process, and I never meant to disrupt your life." William raised his hand. "Please stay. There's something else here." He carefully turned to the final pages of the journal, written just days before Elizabeth's passing. The handwriting was shakier, but still distinctly hers. "My greatest regret," she had written, "is not bringing my two treasures together, my beloved husband and the daughter I had to let go. William's capacity for love would have been enough for both of us. I see that now. But fear and shame kept me silent, and time slipped away too quickly." Sarah rose from her chair, walking to the window. The Manor's gardens stretched out before her, immaculately maintained, a testament to William's dedication to preserving Elizabeth's memory. "Did she—" Sarah hesitated. "Did she ever try to contact my adoptive parents?" William scanned the pages. "Yes, once. They respected her wish to remain anonymous, but sent her photographs and updates about your progress. She keeps mentioning a special gift she prepared for you, a family heirloom." A soft knock at the study door interrupted them. Mrs. Reynolds, the housekeeper, entered with a tea tray. Her eyes widened slightly at the scene before her, William's usually impeccable composure notably absent, a young woman with tears on her cheeks and a sleeping baby on the cushions. "Shall I serve tea, sir?" she asked, maintaining her professional demeanor. "Yes, thank you, Mrs. Reynolds," William replied. As she arranged the tea things, he noticed her curious glances at Sarah. "Mrs. Reynolds, this is Sarah. She's—" He paused, the words feeling strange yet right. "She's Elizabeth's daughter." The housekeeper nearly dropped the teapot. "Miss Elizabeth's—" She looked at Sarah more carefully, and recognition dawned on her face. Oh, good heavens, the resemblance. "Mrs. Reynolds," William said gently, "would you happen to know anything about a gift Elizabeth meant for Sarah? Something she might have set aside?" The housekeeper's hand flew to her throat. "The blue box," she whispered. "In her ladyship's dressing room. She made me promise never to move it." William rose from his desk. "Show us." Chapter 4. The Blue Box. Elizabeth's dressing room remained exactly as she had left it, a shrine to memory that William had never had the heart to change. The afternoon sun streamed through the mullioned windows, illuminating the delicate vanity table where her brushes and perfumes still stood in precise arrangement. Mrs. Reynolds led them to a tall wardrobe of polished rosewood. With reverent care, she opened it to reveal Elizabeth's clothes, still hanging in orderly rows, protected by cloth covers. From the highest shelf, she retrieved a dusty blue leather box, approximately the size of a large book. "She would sit here sometimes," Mrs. Reynolds said softly, holding this box and writing in her journal. "I never dared ask." She handed the box to William, who passed it to Sarah with trembling hands. Sarah settled into Elizabeth's vanity chair, James now awake and contentedly playing with a silver rattle that Mrs. Reynolds had produced from somewhere. The box's brass clasp was stiff with age, but it opened with a soft click. Inside, nestled in faded velvet, lay a collection of treasures. A sterling silver locket, Victorian in design, contained a miniature photograph of Elizabeth as a young woman. Beneath it, a stack of unsealed letters, each dated on Sarah's birthday throughout the years, told the story of a mother's undying love and silent watching. "My darling daughter," the first letter began, dated the day of Sarah's birth. "As I write this, you are just hours old, perfect and beautiful. The hardest thing I will ever do is letting you go, but I do it out of love, praying you'll have opportunities I cannot provide." Sarah read each letter slowly, tears falling freely now. William stood by the window, his own emotions barely contained, as Mrs. Reynolds quietly excused herself from the room. The letters chronicled everything: Sarah's first steps, observed from a discreet distance, her primary school awards, her ballet recitals, all the moments Elizabeth had witnessed but never acknowledged. The final letter, written just weeks before her passing, was different from the others. "My dearest Sarah," it read, "if you are reading this, then you have found your way back to us, though I am no longer here to welcome you. Know that every day without you has been both a sacrifice and a regret. I've left something else for you, the key to understanding everything." Sarah looked up from the letter. "A key?" William moved closer, examining the box. His fingers found a hidden compartment in the lid, revealing a small golden key attached to a silk ribbon. "I recognize this," he said quietly. "It opens Elizabeth's private safe in the library. I couldn't bring myself to open it after—" James chose this moment to drop his rattle, its clatter against the hardwood floor startling them all. Sarah picked him up, holding him close as she had done countless times when seeking comfort herself. "William," she said, her voice steady despite her tears, "we don't have to do this today. It's already so much." He shook his head. "No, we must. Elizabeth wanted this, wanted us to know everything. She's led us this far." As they made their way to the library, Sarah carrying James and William holding the box of letters, neither noticed Mrs. Reynolds watching from the shadows of the hallway, her expression troubled as she reached for the telephone in the butler's pantry. The library, with its towering shelves and leather armchairs, held the same hushed atmosphere as a chapel. William led them to a particular panel of oak, which swung open to reveal a small wall safe. The key slid in perfectly. Inside lay a single envelope thick with documents and a vintage Cartier box. William opened the envelope first, his face paling as he read its contents. "These are legal papers," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Elizabeth set up a trust fund for you, Sarah. She's been adding to it all these years, and there's something else." He pulled out a letter addressed to him. "My beloved William," he read aloud, "if you're reading this, then you've met our daughter. Yes, ours, for though she wasn't born of our union, she has always been meant to be part of our family. I know you're hurt by my silence, but I pray you'll understand. The trust fund isn't just for Sarah, it's for her children too. Give them the love I was too afraid to show openly." The Cartier box contained a charm bracelet, each charm representing a milestone in Sarah's life that Elizabeth had secretly witnessed. A tiny ballet shoe, a graduation cap, a baby booty recently added, as if Elizabeth had known about James somehow. Sarah sank into one of the library's leather armchairs, overwhelmed. James reached for the bracelet, his tiny fingers catching the light that played off its silver surface. "She knew about him," Sarah whispered. "But how?" William studied the dates on the trust fund documents. "The last edition was made just 2 weeks before we lost her. She must have known about your pregnancy." The sound of a car crunching on the gravel drive outside drew their attention. William moved to the window, his expression darkening slightly. "Richard Blackwood," he said. "My solicitor. But I didn't call him." Chapter 5. The Intruder. Richard Blackwood's polished brogues echoed through the manor's hallway as Mrs. Reynolds led him to the library. His tailored suit and carefully arranged silver hair projected an image of authority he had cultivated over 30 years as the Ashworth family solicitor. William stood to receive him, his posture stiffening automatically. Sarah remained seated, instinctively drawing James closer to her chest. "William?" Richard nodded curtly, then cast a calculating glance at Sarah and the baby. "Mrs. Reynolds telephoned with some concerning news." William's eyes flickered to the doorway, where Mrs. Reynolds hovered, her face a mixture of worry and apology. "That wasn't necessary, Mrs. Reynolds. You may go." "I believe it was entirely necessary," Richard interjected, placing his leather briefcase on a side table. "When a stranger appears claiming to be Elizabeth's daughter, it's my duty to protect your interests." Sarah rose from her chair, her chin lifted in a gesture so reminiscent of Elizabeth that William felt his heart constrict. "I'm not claiming anything, Mr. Blackwood. I only wanted to know about my birth mother." Richard's lips thinned. "And coincidentally found one of the wealthiest men in Hampshire. I've seen such situations before, young lady. They rarely end well for anyone." "Richard," William's voice carried a warning tone, "Sarah has documentation. Elizabeth left letters, trust papers, which need to be thoroughly authenticated," Richard cut in smoothly. He reached for the blue box and its contents, but William stepped between him and the desk. "These are family matters, Richard. Private ones." The solicitor's expression hardened. "William, you're not thinking clearly. Consider the implications. This young woman appears out of nowhere with a child in tow, and you simply accept her story. What would Elizabeth think of you risking everything she helped you build?" "Elizabeth?" William's voice rose slightly. "Elizabeth wanted this. She arranged it all, the trust fund, the letters, everything. She wanted Sarah to find us." James began to fuss, picking up on the tension in the room. Sarah soothed him automatically, swaying gently. The gesture caught Richard's attention, his eyes narrowing. "And the child? Another convenient addition to tug at your heartstrings? William, you're still grieving. It makes you vulnerable to—" "Stop!" William's command cut through the air like a blade. "You forget yourself, Richard. I may be your client, but this is my home and Sarah is—" He paused, then continued firmly, "Sarah is Elizabeth's daughter. Our daughter." Richard opened his briefcase, withdrawing a sheaf of papers. "Then you leave me no choice. As executor of Elizabeth's estate, I have a responsibility to investigate any claims against it. I've taken the liberty of drafting some preliminary paperwork, DNA tests, financial disclosures, background checks." Sarah stepped forward, her free hand clutching the charm bracelet. "I don't want anything from the estate. I never asked for money. Yet you've already accessed private family documents," Richard noted coldly, "and Elizabeth's personal belongings." "Documents Elizabeth left for her," William countered. "You're overstepping, Richard. I suggest you leave." The solicitor straightened his tie. "I'll leave these papers for your review. But William, consider this carefully. A man in your position, there are people who would take advantage, like you've been doing for years." All heads turned to the doorway. Mrs. Reynolds stood there, clutching a leather portfolio. Her usual deferential manner had vanished. "Mrs. Reynolds," Richard began, but she cut him off. "I've kept quiet for too long," she said, approaching William. "This was in her ladyship's private desk. I found it last year during the spring cleaning, but, well, after reading it, I was afraid to show anyone." She handed the portfolio to William. Inside were bank statements, correspondence, and a detailed report from a private investigator. As William scanned the documents, his face darkened. "Creative accounting, Richard. Investment funds redirected to personal accounts? Elizabeth suspected, didn't she? That's why she set up Sarah's trust through a different firm." Richard's composed facade cracked slightly. "Those documents are clearly fraudulent. I've served this family faithfully for decades." "Get out." William's voice was quiet, but carried an authority that brooked no argument. "Expect to hear from my new solicitors in the morning." For a moment, Richard seemed ready to argue further, but something in William's expression stopped him. He gathered his briefcase and papers, straightening his shoulders. "You're making a mistake, William. This situation, it isn't what Elizabeth would have wanted." "No," William replied, looking at Sarah and James. This is exactly what Elizabeth wanted. She just ran out of time to make it happen herself. After Richard's departure, the library fell into heavy silence. Sarah sank back into her chair, trembling slightly. William moved to the drinks cabinet, pouring himself a small brandy. "I'm so sorry," Sarah whispered. "I never meant to cause such trouble." William crossed the room, kneeling beside her chair despite his aged knees. "You haven't caused trouble, my dear. You've brought truth. And perhaps," he smiled gently at James, who had fallen asleep against his mother's shoulder, "a second chance at family." Chapter 6. Echoes of the Past. The evening settled over Ashworth Manor like a gentle blanket, the last rays of sunlight painting the library's oak paneling in warm honey tones. Mrs. Reynolds had brought fresh tea and insisted on preparing one of the guest suites for Sarah and James, brushing aside their protests with grandmotherly efficiency. William sat in his favorite armchair, watching Sarah explore the library's family photographs. She paused before a large portrait above the fireplace, Elizabeth in her wedding dress, radiant with happiness. "She was beautiful," Sarah said softly, touching her own cheek as if searching for similarities. "You have her smile," William observed, "and her determination, the way you stood up to Richard today. Pure Elizabeth." Sarah turned from the portrait, cradling a sleeping James. "I keep thinking about her letters. All those years watching from a distance, it must have been painful," William finished. "For everyone." He retrieved the journal from his desk, opening it to a marked page. "Listen to this entry from 1998. Saw her in the park today playing on the swings. Her laughter carried across the garden, and for a moment I imagined running to her, gathering her in my arms. But I remained hidden, protecting her from the complications my presence would bring." Sarah settled into the chair opposite him, adjusting James's blanket. "I remember that park. We lived nearby until I was 10. I used to spend hours on those swings, pretending I could fly away and find my real family." She paused, then added quietly, "My adoptive parents. They were kind, but there was always something missing. A connection I couldn't explain." William studied her face in the fading light. "Tell me about them, please." Sarah's expression softened with memories. "They were teachers. Dad taught mathematics. Mum taught literature. They always encouraged me to study, to reach for more. But when I got pregnant with James, those things changed. They had such different plans for my life." "And James's father?" Sarah's hands tightened slightly on the baby's blanket. "A mistake. He wasn't ready for responsibility. When I told him about the baby, he simply disappeared." William felt a surge of protective anger, quickly suppressed. "And your adoptive parents?" "They offered to help, but on their terms. They wanted me to give James up for adoption, just as I had been. Said it was for the best." Sarah's voice caught. I couldn't do to him what had been done to me. Even though I understand now why Elizabeth made that choice, I just couldn't." The parallels weren't lost on William. He rose, walking to the window where the garden lay in deepening shadow. "Elizabeth would have understood. She would have supported your choice." A small sound from James drew their attention. The baby stretched in his sleep, one tiny hand clutching at empty air. Without thinking, William reached out, offering his finger. James's grip was surprisingly strong. "He needs a cot," William said suddenly. "And proper baby things. The shops in the village will be closed, but I'm sure we can arrange something for tonight." "Oh, we'll be fine," Sarah started to protest, but William was already reaching for the telephone. "Mrs. Reynolds?" "Yes, could you ask Thompson to bring up the old cradle from the attic? The one from the nursery the one Elizabeth chose." He paused, listening. "Yes, and any baby linens we might have stored." Sarah watched him, tears threatening again. "You don't have to." "Yes, I do." William's voice was firm. "Elizabeth prepared for this moment. She wanted you here, wanted you to have a home with us. I was too lost in grief to see it before, but finding you, finding James, it's not just about the past. It's about the future she tried to arrange for all of us." Mrs. Reynolds appeared with remarkable speed, directing Thompson and another footman as they carried in a beautifully carved oak cradle. The wood gleamed with care despite years of storage, its bedding fresh and crisp. "Her ladyship chose this herself," Mrs. Reynolds explained, fussing with the blankets. "Said it had to be perfect, though we never—" She trailed off, glancing at William. "Though we never had children of our own." William finished quietly. She kept it all these years hoping. Sarah rose, laying James gently in the cradle. He settled immediately, sighing in contentment. The three adults stood watching him sleep, each lost in their own thoughts about paths not taken and second chances granted. "There's so much to arrange," William said finally. "Your things to collect, legal matters to sort out, proper ones this time, without Richard's interference. And we'll need to prepare proper rooms for you both. The guest suite is fine for tonight, but you should have your own space, somewhere you can make your own." Sarah touched the cradle's smooth wood. "I don't want to impose—" "You're not imposing," William interrupted gently. "You're coming home. It's what Elizabeth wanted. It's what I want too, if you'll allow it." Through the library window, the first stars were appearing in the darkening sky. Somewhere in the garden, a nightingale began to sing, its sweet notes floating up to them like a blessing. Chapter 7. New Beginnings. The following week brought changes to Ashworth Manor that none of its long-serving staff could have anticipated. The East Wing, silent for decades, came alive with the sounds of renovation as William insisted on creating proper living quarters for Sarah and James. The dust sheets disappeared from furniture, windows were thrown open to fresh air, and the echoing corridors filled with purpose once again. Sarah stood in what would become James's nursery, watching as workers carefully restored the hand-painted carousel mural that Elizabeth had commissioned years ago. The colors were as bright as ever beneath the dust, prancing horses and golden poles spinning in an eternal dance across the walls. "She designed this room herself," Mrs. Reynolds explained, arranging stuffed animals on newly installed shelves. "Said every child deserved a bit of magic in their world." William appeared in the doorway, his silver hair slightly disheveled from supervising the renovations. "The furniture arrives tomorrow. I hope you don't mind, but I took the liberty of ordering everything from Harrods. Elizabeth always said they had the finest baby things." Sarah turned to him, overwhelmed by his generosity. "It's too much, really. James and I were managing fine with basics." "Nonsense," William interrupted gently. "Besides, I have 27 years of grandfather duties to catch up on." The word grandfather hung in the air between them, new and precious. James, secured in his baby swing nearby, gurgled happily as if in agreement. Later that afternoon, as Sarah unpacked her modest belongings in her new suite, she found Elizabeth's charm bracelet at the bottom of her bag. Each charm caught the light, telling its own story of secret love and distant watching. She clasped it around her wrist, the silver warm against her skin. A soft knock at the door revealed William, carrying a leather album. "I found something you might like to see," he said, settling into one of the elegant wingback chairs by the fireplace. Elizabeth's photography albums. She was quite talented with a camera. Sarah joined him, and together they turned the pages. To her astonishment, she found herself looking at photographs she'd never seen before, herself as a child playing in that park with the swings at school sports days, even at her university graduation, taken from a distance but capturing moments she thought had been lost to time. "She was there for everything," William murmured. "Always watching, always caring, even if she couldn't show it." One photograph made Sarah pause. It showed her outside a cafe, visibly pregnant with James, her face turned away from the camera, but her posture unmistakable. "This was just months ago," she whispered. "How?" William studied the image. "The private investigator she used, Jenkins. He continued sending updates even after we lost her. Said it was his last duty to her. I found the receipts in those papers Mrs. Reynolds discovered." Sarah traced her finger over the photograph. "I felt so alone then. If I'd known—" "You're not alone now," William assured her. He hesitated, then added, "I've been thinking about the trust fund Elizabeth set up. It's considerable, enough to ensure you and James will never want for anything. But there's something else I'd like to discuss." Sarah tensed slightly, but William continued, his voice gentle. "The manor itself, it's too big for one old man. Elizabeth always said it needed children's laughter to make it a proper home again. I'd like to change my will, make you and James my heirs, not just to the trust fund, but to everything." "William, no," Sarah protested. "I don't want people thinking that's why I came looking for my birth mother. I'm not here for any inheritance." "I know that," he smiled. "You've proved it repeatedly by refusing every offer of financial help. But this isn't about money, it's about family. Elizabeth wanted this place to be your home, wanted you to have the life she couldn't give you before. Please, let me honor her wishes." Before Sarah could respond, a commotion erupted from the hallway. Mrs. Reynolds appeared, slightly breathless. "Sir, you have visitors. The Blackwoods are here, Richard and his wife. They're quite insistent about speaking with you." William's expression hardened. "Send them away." "They're threatening to go to the papers, sir," Mrs. Reynolds continued reluctantly. "Mrs. Blackwood is saying things about Miss Sarah and young Master James. Unkind things." Sarah stood, squaring her shoulders in a gesture that reminded William so strongly of Elizabeth facing down boardroom opponents. "Let them come. I have nothing to hide, and neither did my mother." William studied her face, seeing the strength behind her vulnerability. "Very well. Mrs. Reynolds, show them to the library, and please bring tea, Elizabeth's best china, I think. Let's show them exactly who we are." Chapter 8. Standing Ground. The library had witnessed many confrontations over the years, but none quite like this. Richard Blackwood and his wife Victoria sat rigidly on the edge of their chairs, while William occupied his usual seat with deliberate casualness. Sarah stood by the fireplace, one hand resting on James's cradle, the other touching Elizabeth's bracelet for courage. Victoria Blackwood broke the silence first, her cut-glass accent sharp with disapproval. "Really, William, you must see how this looks. Taking in a complete stranger, letting her access private family papers, offering her a home." "She's not a stranger," William interrupted calmly. "She's Elizabeth's daughter." "Our daughter. A daughter conveniently appearing just as you're considering selling the estate to that development group?" Richard interjected. "The timing seems rather suspect." Sarah's head snapped up. "Selling the estate?" William waved his hand dismissively. "An offer I received last month I had no intention of accepting." "But you should," Richard pressed. "The property market is at its peak. The manor requires extensive maintenance, and without an heir—" "I have an heir," William stated firmly. "Two, in fact." He gestured to Sarah and James. Victoria's perfectly arranged features twisted slightly. "You can't be serious. This person appears with a baby in tow, spins a tale about being Elizabeth's secret child, and you're ready to hand over everything? What proof do you have besides some easily forged letters?" Sarah moved to speak, but William held up his hand. He reached for Elizabeth's journal, opening it to a specific page. "Victoria, you were at our wedding. Do you remember Elizabeth something borrowed?" Victoria frowned. "That old pearl necklace." "What of it?" "Not old, Victorian. A family heirloom." William turned to Sarah. "The charm bracelet, my dear. May I see it?" Sarah unclasped the bracelet, handing it to William. He held it up, pointing to a tiny charm hidden among the others, a perfect miniature of the pearl necklace. Elizabeth had this made the day Sarah was born. Each charm represents a moment in her daughter's life. This one, he indicated another charm, a tiny silver book, was added when Sarah won the county spelling competition in year 4. "You reported on it for the local paper, didn't you, Victoria?" Victoria's face paled slightly. "That was 20 years ago. How could you possibly—" "Because Elizabeth kept everything." William retrieved a folder from his desk. "News clippings, photographs, school reports, all collected by Jenkins, the same investigator who, if I recall, helped you locate your own adopted sister in 1992. Richard stood abruptly. "That's entirely different. This is about protecting your interest, William. Think of the scandal, the publicity. The publicity you're threatening to create." Sarah's voice was quiet but firm. "I came here looking for answers about my birth mother. I found more than I expected. A history of love, of regret, of hope. If you go to the papers, you'll only be confirming the depth of Elizabeth's feelings, her dedication to watching over her child even from a distance, and revealing your own financial improprieties," William added, patting the leather portfolio Mrs. Reynolds had provided. "Shall we discuss those investment accounts in the Cayman Islands?" The color drained from Richard's face. Victoria clutched her handbag tighter, her knuckles white. "You wouldn't dare. The scandal would affect you too." "I'm an old man who just found his family," William replied simply. "What do I care for scandal? But you, Richard, the Law Society takes a rather dim view of solicitors mishandling client funds." A tense silence filled the room, broken only by James's soft cooing as he played with a stuffed rabbit in his cradle. The sound seemed to draw everyone's attention, a reminder of innocence amidst adult complications. Victoria stood, smoothing her skirt with trembling hands. "We should go, Richard. Clearly, William has made his choice." "Indeed I have," William agreed. "Mrs. Reynolds will show you out. And Richard? I expect those financial records on my new solicitor's desk by Monday." After they left, Sarah sank into a chair, shaking slightly. "I never meant to cause such chaos in your life." William moved to the drinks cabinet, pouring them each a small sherry. "You haven't caused chaos, my dear. You've helped clear away years of deception. Elizabeth would be proud of how you handled yourself." "Would she?" Sarah asked softly. "Sometimes I wonder if she regretted her choice giving me up." William handed her a glass, then lifted James from his cradle, settling the content baby on his knee. "She regretted the necessity, not the choice itself. She wanted to give you your best chance. And now, by some miracle, we have a second chance to be the family she always wanted us to be." Through the library window, the garden glowed in the late afternoon sun. The roses Elizabeth had planted were in full bloom, their fragrance drifting in on the breeze. As if on cue, James reached for one of William's silver cufflinks, his tiny fingers wrapping around it with complete trust. "Family," Sarah whispered, watching them together. "I think I'm finally beginning to understand what that really means." Chapter 9. The Hidden Letter. 3 months had transformed Ashworth Manor from a mausoleum of memories into a living, breathing home. The sound of James's laughter echoed through corridors that had known only silence for decades. The gardens, once maintained with military precision, now featured a colourful playground that William had insisted on installing despite the gardeners' protests. On this particular autumn morning, Sarah sat at Elizabeth's old writing desk in her suite, sorting through years of accumulated correspondence she'd found in a drawer. Most were ordinary letters, social invitations, thank you notes, charity acknowledgements. But beneath them all lay a sealed envelope, yellowed with age, addressed simply, "For the day you find her." Sarah's hands trembled as she opened it, recognizing Elizabeth's handwriting. "My dearest William, if you're reading this, then our daughter has found her way home and I'm no longer there to explain everything. There's one last secret I've kept, one final truth you both deserve to know. The day I discovered I was pregnant, I was terrified, not of motherhood, but of losing you. We had only been married 2 years, and I knew how deeply you wanted children of your own. I feared you would see my past as a betrayal, that my child from another man would come between us. But as I wrote in my journal all those years, watching our daughter grow from afar, I realized my greatest mistake wasn't in having her. It was in not trusting your capacity for love. You would have embraced her as your own, just as you embraced every child who crossed your path. There's a final gift I've arranged, something I hope will heal the wounds my silence has caused. In the garden beneath the oak tree where you first proposed, I've buried a time capsule. Inside is everything I couldn't say in person, my hopes for our daughter, my dreams for you both, and the truth about why I had to let her go. The key to the capsule is hanging on the charm bracelet, the tiny silver acorn you never noticed among the other charms. It was always meant to lead you both home. All my love, Elizabeth." William found Sarah still at the desk, tears streaming down her face. Without a word, he gathered her into his arms, holding her as she hadn't been held since childhood. "She always meant for us to be together," Sarah whispered. "Even at the end, she was planning." "She was remarkable that way," William agreed softly. "Always thinking ahead, always protecting those she loved." He glanced at the charm bracelet on Sarah's wrist. "Shall we see what other secrets that oak tree holds?" The autumn air was crisp as they made their way to the ancient oak. James bundled warmly in William's arms. Mrs. Reynolds followed with a spade, though she insisted they let Thompson do the actual digging. The earth beneath the oak yielded its treasure easily. A brass box, small but heavy with contents. The tiny acorn charm fit its lock perfectly. Inside they found a collection of memories that brought fresh tears to their eyes. Photographs of Elizabeth during her pregnancy, her face glowing with love for the child she carried. A letter to Sarah's biological father, never sent, explaining her decision to raise their child alone. School reports, newspaper clippings, and childhood drawings that Sarah recognized from her own past, all carefully preserved. But it was the final item that caught their breath, a leather-bound book titled The Story of Us, filled with Elizabeth's elegant handwriting. It began with her own childhood, traced through her first love affair, her marriage to William, and the painful decision to give up her baby. But it didn't end there. The pages continued through years of secret watching, of pride in Sarah's accomplishments, of joy in William's successes. The final entry, dated just weeks before they lost her, read, "My greatest wish is that someday you'll all find each other. William, with your generous heart. Sarah, with your quiet strength. And perhaps, God willing, grandchildren to fill these halls with the laughter I've always dreamed of hearing. Love finds a way, even across time and silence. Trust in that, as I always have." James chose that moment to reach for the book, his tiny fingers brushing the pages his grandmother had written. William laughed softly, bouncing him gently. "She would have adored you, little one," he said, "just as she adored your mother, even from afar." Sarah touched the book gently. I wish I could have known her, really known her, not just through letters and memories." "You do know her," William replied. "Every time you show that same quiet strength she wrote about, every time you put James's needs before your own, just as she did for you. She lives in both of you." As they walked back to the manor, the autumn sun casting long shadows across the lawn, Sarah noticed something she hadn't before. A rose bush heavy with late blooms, its flowers the exact shade of pink as the ones in her earliest memory, the ones that had grown outside her childhood home. "She planted those the year you moved to Surrey," William explained, following her gaze. "Said she wanted a piece of your world in hers, even if she couldn't be part of it directly." Sarah picked one perfect bloom, tucking it into James's blanket. "She was always part of it. We just didn't know how much until now." Chapter 10. Healing Hearts. The discovery of Elizabeth's time capsule changed something fundamental at Ashworth Manor. It was as if her final gift had given them all permission to truly become a family, to stop tiptoeing around their shared past and embrace their future together. William threw himself into his role as grandfather with unexpected enthusiasm. His business associates were startled to find their meetings occasionally interrupted by a crawling baby, or to see the distinguished businessman on the floor, demonstrating the proper technique for stacking building blocks. Sarah watched these interactions with a mixture of joy and lingering sadness, wondering about all the years they had missed. But as autumn deepened into winter, she found herself creating new traditions to blend with the old ones. One snowy evening, as they sat in the library after putting James to bed, William brought out a familiar envelope, the offer for the manor from the development group. "They've increased their bid," he said, placing the papers on the desk. "Quite substantially, actually. Richard wasn't wrong about the maintenance costs, and with the economy changing..." Sarah felt her heart sink. Despite everything, she had grown to love the manor, with its quirky corners and endless rooms full of history. "If it's a financial concern, I can look for work. My degree in architecture." William chuckled, reaching for the papers. With deliberate ceremony, he fed them into the fireplace, watching as the flames consumed them. "My dear, I'm not selling. I just wanted you to know that I had the choice, and I'm choosing this. Choosing us. This place isn't just a house or an investment. It's where Elizabeth watched our family grow, even if she had to do it from a distance. It's where James took his first steps last week. It's home." Sarah relaxed, smiling. Those developers would have ruined the gardens anyway. Elizabeth's roses. Precisely. Speaking of which, William reached into his desk drawer, withdrawing a slim folder. "I've had the estate planners draw up some ideas. The East Wing renovations are just the beginning. I thought perhaps, with your architectural background, you might help design some updates, make the place more suitable for a young family." The plans showed thoughtful modifications, modernized living spaces that respected the manor's heritage while making it more comfortable for contemporary life. But it was the notation on one page that brought tears to Sarah's eyes. "Elizabeth's Wing, family quarters." "I thought it was time to stop thinking of it as the East Wing," William explained softly. "After all, she brought us together here. It seems fitting." Sarah traced the words with her finger. "I've been thinking about her so much lately, especially with James growing so quickly. All the moments she missed with me." "She didn't miss them," William corrected gently. "She was there for every important moment, even if she couldn't show it. And now, through you and James, she's still here for every new moment." A cry from the baby monitor interrupted them, James's way of demanding his evening feed. As Sarah rose to attend to him, William followed, their footsteps echoing through the familiar corridors. The nursery, with its restored carousel mural, had become Sarah's favorite room in the house. James stood in his cot, greeting them with a bright smile that melted away any lingering sadness. "You know," William said, lifting James into his arms, "Elizabeth always said a house needs 3 generations to make it a proper home. I never quite understood what she meant until now." Sarah prepared James's bottle, watching as he snuggled contentedly against William's shoulder. "Did you ever imagine this 6 months ago? Us here like this?" William smiled, his eyes bright with emotion. "No, I was too lost in memories, too afraid of change. But Elizabeth knew, didn't she? She knew we'd need each other." Through the nursery window, snowflakes danced in the garden lights, transforming the familiar landscape into something magical. The old oak tree stood sentinel, its branches dusted with white, still guarding its memories of Elizabeth's hopes and dreams. "I've been reading her journal," Sarah admitted. "The one from the time capsule. There's so much love in those pages, so much longing, but also so much hope. She never gave up believing that somehow, someday, we'd find our way here." William adjusted James's blanket, humming softly, the same lullaby, Sarah realized, that she remembered from her own childhood dreams. Elizabeth always said that love finds its own path. We just have to be brave enough to follow where it leads. As James drifted off to sleep, Sarah and William stood together, watching the snow fall outside. The manor settled around them with comfortable creaks and sighs. No longer a museum of memories, but a living home embracing past and present, grief and joy, endings and beginnings. In the quiet of the nursery, surrounded by the carousel horses that Elizabeth had chosen so long ago, they had finally found what she had always wished for them, not just a family bound by blood or law, but one bound by love, understanding, and the courage to embrace second chances. Chapter 11, Full Circle. Spring returned to Ashworth Manor, bringing with it James's first birthday. The gardens Elizabeth had lovingly tended now bloomed with renewed purpose, as if nature itself was celebrating the family's reunion. The morning light filtered through the newly installed conservatory windows, where Sarah sat with her architectural plans spread before her. The past year had transformed not just the manor, but everyone within it. William had emerged from his shell of grief, his business associates remarking on his renewed vigor. Sarah had found her footing not just as a mother and daughter, but as a professional, gradually taking on the restoration projects that would carry the manor into its next chapter. "The contractors can start next week," Sarah explained to William over breakfast, James happily making a mess of his porridge nearby. "The foundation work for the new wing is ready, and I've incorporated all of Elizabeth's original garden designs." William nodded approvingly, deftly wiping James's face between bites. "She would have loved seeing you take charge like this, though I suspect she'd be more interested in the party preparations." The upcoming celebration was to be more than just James's birthday party. William had decided it was time to formally introduce Sarah to Hampshire society, not as a mysterious addition to the household, but as his daughter and heir. The invitations had gone out, raising eyebrows and sparking curiosity throughout the county. "Are you sure about this?" Sarah asked, not for the first time. "It will cause talk." "Let them talk," William replied firmly. "Elizabeth kept too many secrets for too long. It's time for truth, time to celebrate our family openly." Mrs. Reynolds entered with fresh tea and a small package that had just arrived. "From Jenkins, sir," she said, placing it beside William's plate. The package contained a USB drive and a note. "Found these in my old files. Thought you might want them for the celebration. Last of Elizabeth's surveillance photos." Sarah connected the drive to her laptop, and together they watched as images filled the screen. Elizabeth had captured moments they'd never known she witnessed. Sarah's graduation party, her first architecture job interview, even her first ultrasound appointment when she was pregnant with James. "She knew about him," Sarah whispered, touching the screen. "She knew she was going to be a grandmother." William squeezed her hand, and she made sure we'd all find each other. "Jenkins told me she updated her instructions to him just weeks before we lost her. She knew somehow that the time was coming for all her plans to come together." As they prepared for the party, the manor buzzed with activity. The great hall was transformed with flowers and lights. The carousel theme from James's nursery echoed in delicate decorations that would tell their story to those willing to see it. Sarah stood in Elizabeth's old dressing room, now her own, wearing a dress they'd found in one of the wardrobes, a classic design that Elizabeth had never worn, the tag still attached, in exactly Sarah's size. Another piece of her mother's careful planning. "She bought it for you," Mrs. Reynolds had explained, misty-eyed. "Said she had a feeling you'd need it someday." The mirror reflected not just Sarah, but echoes of Elizabeth, in the curve of her smile, the tilt of her head, the way she absently touched the charm bracelet that never left her wrist. James crawled across the floor in his tiny suit, reaching for the silver acorn charm that had led them to the oak tree's secrets. William appeared in the doorway, impeccable in his dinner jacket. "Ready?" Sarah lifted James into her arms, breathing in his sweet baby scent. Almost. Just one thing left. Together they made their way to the family cemetery. Elizabeth's grave, always meticulously maintained, had been enhanced with a new addition, a small bronze plaque that read, "Beloved wife, mother and grandmother, your love guided us home." Sarah placed a single rose beside the headstone, its petals the same shade of pink as those that had followed her through childhood. James reached out to touch the cool bronze, his tiny fingers tracing letters he couldn't yet read. "I wish you could be here," Sarah whispered to the quiet air. "Really here. To see how your plans worked out, to hold your grandson, to know that we're happy." William wrapped an arm around her shoulders. "She knows, my dear, somehow she always knew." From the manor they could hear the first cars arriving, gravel crunching under expensive tires. The time had come to share their story with the world, to stand together as the family Elizabeth had always dreamed they would be. "Ready now?" William asked again, offering his arm. Sarah straightened her shoulders, Elizabeth's daughter in every way. "Ready. Let's go tell them who we are." Chapter 12. Love's Legacy. The great hall of Ashworth Manor glowed with warmth as Hampshire's finest gathered to celebrate what they thought was simply a child's first birthday. The whispers and curious glances were inevitable as Sarah stood beside William. James perfectly behaved in her arms, but they faced the scrutiny together. William stepped forward to address the assembled guests, his voice strong and clear. "Thank you all for joining us today. While we're here to celebrate my grandson James's first birthday, there's another celebration equally dear to my heart." He gestured to Sarah, who moved to stand beside him. "Many of you knew my late wife, Elizabeth. What you didn't know was that she had a daughter, given up for adoption before our marriage. That daughter found her way back to us last year, guided by Elizabeth's careful planning and endless love." The room hushed as William continued, his hand resting protectively on Sarah's shoulder. "Today, I'm proud to introduce my daughter, Sarah Ashworth, and my grandson, James. They are my family, my heirs, and the greatest gift Elizabeth could have left us." Victoria Blackwood's face was a study in barely concealed emotion from her position near the back of the room, but Richard was notably absent. The other guests, perhaps taking their cue from William's evident joy, began to move forward with congratulations and welcomes. As the evening progressed, Sarah found herself sharing carefully edited versions of their story, touched by the genuine warmth she received. James charmed everyone he met, his baby giggles cutting through any remaining tension. In a quiet moment, Sarah slipped away to Elizabeth's favorite spot in the conservatory. The night air was sweet with roses, and through the glass ceiling, stars twinkled like scattered diamonds. "I thought I'd find you here," William said softly, joining her. "Elizabeth always came here to think." Sarah smiled, adjusting a sleeping James in her arms. "It feels right somehow, like she's still watching over us." "She is, in her way." William gestured to the gardens beyond the glass. "Everything she planned, every choice she made led us to this moment. The manor, the gardens, the trust fund, they were never just about money or property. They were her way of making sure we'd have a home together, even if she couldn't be here to see it." Mrs. Reynolds appeared with champagne and a gentle reminder that guests were asking for them. As they prepared to return to the party, William paused, drawing something from his pocket. "I found this in Elizabeth's study this morning," he said, handing Sarah an envelope. It was marked, "For the day they all know." Sarah opened it carefully, mindful of James sleeping against her shoulder. Inside was a single photograph she'd never seen before. Elizabeth, young and radiant, holding a newborn baby. On the back, in her elegant handwriting, "Sarah, my greatest love. May you always know that every choice I made was guided by love." Tears blurred Sarah's vision as she studied her mother's face, seeing in it all the love and hope that had shaped their lives. William wrapped his arms around both her and James, creating a circle of family that bridged past and present. "We should rejoin the party," Sarah said finally, tucking the precious photograph into her dress pocket, close to her heart. "In a moment," William replied. "First, I want you to look around, really look at what Elizabeth created for us." From their vantage point in the conservatory, they could see the entire manor spread before them. The lights from the party spilled onto the lawns, where the old oak tree stood sentinel over their shared memories. The newly restored east wing, Elizabeth's wing, gleamed with promise. In the distance, the family cemetery lay peaceful under starlight, no longer a place of sorrow but a connection to the love that had brought them together. "It's not just a house anymore, is it?" Sarah observed softly. "No," William agreed. "It's everything Elizabeth hoped it would be. A home, a haven, a place where love finds its way through time and silence to bring family together." James stirred slightly, his small hand clutching Sarah's charm bracelet. The silver acorn caught the light, a tiny reminder of the secrets that had led them home. As they walked back to their guests, Sarah felt Elizabeth's presence in every step, every breath, every moment of joy that filled the manor's halls. The secrets were gone, replaced by open hearts and shared love. Elizabeth's final gift had been not just the truth, but the courage to embrace it. In the great hall, William raised his glass, the assembled guests following suit. "To family," he said simply, his eyes meeting Sarah's across the room. "To love that finds its way home." The crystal glasses chimed like bells, their sound echoing through the manor that had witnessed so much love, loss, and renewal. Outside, the roses Elizabeth had planted bloomed under starlight, their fragrance drifting in on the evening breeze, a reminder that some loves never fade, they simply wait for the right moment to bloom again.